Imagine a place where people aren't treated, but simply hidden away from the world. An old building in London, behind whose thick stone walls you can hear screams, laughter, and whispers, but no one tries to understand them. It's not a prison, nor is it a monastery. It is the first psychiatric hospital in history, the Royal Hospital of Bethlehem. Here, people were kept in chains. People came to watch them as if they were a form of entertainment. And the word madness didn't mean an illness, but a sentence. But the strangest thing is that this is exactly where the history of treating the mind began. How did a place of fear become the birthplace of science? Who was the first to decide that these people shouldn't be locked away, but understood? Today you'll learn how it all really began. And if you're interested in stories that are quieter than a scream, but deeper than time, subscribe and like to support the channel. Long before the word psychiatry so existed, long before anyone spoke of neurons or neurotransmitters or the chemical architecture of the mind, there was simply the question of what to do with those who had lost their way inside their own heads. It was a question that ancient societies answered badly, medieval societies answered worse, and early modern societies only began, slowly, imperfectly, and often cruelly, to answer at all. The year 1247 in London was not a year of particular upheaval. Henry III sat on the English throne. The city smelled of the Thames and livestock. Streets were narrow, life was short, and the explanations available to ordinary people for the great catastrophes of existence, illness, grief, the sudden unraveling of a person's mind, were religious in nature. God rewarded the faithful and punished the wicked. The devil reached into souls and twisted them. When someone's behavior became strange or violent or incomprehensible, the diagnosis was rarely medical. It was moral, spiritual, supernatural. It was into this world that a small priory was founded near the edge of the city, on land donated to the Bishop of Bethlehem, a religious order whose full name translated into English as the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem. The institution was modest at the start, a place for monks, a place for prayer, a place intended to support crusading efforts in the Holy Land and to serve as a gathering point for the order's members passing through England. No one who laid its foundation stones intended to build a psychiatric hospital. The word did not exist. The concept barely existed. What they were building, they believed, was a house of God. But cities have a way of filling available space with their most urgent problems. And in the medieval city, few problems were more urgent or more visible than the men and women who wandered the streets in states that others could not explain. Some were violent. Some were mute and distant. Some heard voices. Some had lost the capacity to feed themselves, or find shelter, or recognize the faces of the people who loved them. They were everywhere, and no one knew what to do with them. Within a century of the priory's founding, something had shifted. By the mid-1300s, records indicate that the institution had begun admitting people we would today recognize as individuals experiencing severe mental illness. The transition was gradual, unannounced, undramatic in the way that most historical turning points are undramatic when you are living through them. There was no ceremony. No physician stood at a podium and declared that a new era of treatment had begun. There was simply the practical reality of a building with space, a city with suffering people, and the need to put them somewhere. This is the founding paradox of what would eventually become known as Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and, in popular speech, simply as Bedlam. It began not as a solution, but as a convenience, not as an act of compassion, but as an act of containment. The institution did not open its doors to the mentally ill because society had developed a sophisticated understanding of their needs. It opened those doors because those people existed, because their existence was visible and disruptive, and because a building existed to receive them. That is a significant distinction, and one that would shape the character of the institution and the broader history of psychiatric care for centuries to come. What greeted the first patients who were brought to Bethlehem was not treatment in any meaningful sense of the word. The medieval worldview did not accommodate the idea that mental illness was a disease of the body or the brain, subject to diagnosis and remedy in the way that a broken leg might be set or a fever brought down with herbs. If a person's behavior was disordered, the disorder was presumed to have a spiritual cause. The appropriate responses were prayer, fasting, exorcism, and moral instruction. If those failed, and they often did, the response became physical restraint. Chains were used, not as instruments of torture exactly, but as instruments of management. A person who could not be reasoned with, who might harm themselves or others, who had become, in the language of the time, lunatic. A word that blamed the moon for madness, needed to be prevented from doing damage. The chain accomplished this. It was, in the logic of the era, a practical solution to a practical problem. That it degraded the person wearing it, that it compounded suffering rather than alleviating it, that it transformed the human being into something closer to a caged animal. These considerations belong to a moral vocabulary that would take centuries more to fully develop. The building itself offered little comfort. Cold stone, poor ventilation, insufficient food, no privacy. The lives of the patients at early Bethlehem were lives of deprivation layered atop whatever distress had brought them there in the first place. There were no trained staff in any modern sense, no nurses, no physicians specializing in mental illness, no therapists. There were keepers, people whose job was supervision and restraint, and whose understanding of the people in their care was minimal. Mental illness was something you watched over, not something you treated. And yet, and this matters, the institution existed. For all its cruelties and limitations, for all the ways in which it failed the people within its walls, Bethlehem represented something genuinely new in the history of how societies deal with mental illness. Before such institutions, there was nothing. There was the street, the jail, the monastery, the home of a family too frightened or exhausted to cope. There was abandonment in its various forms. Bethlehem, for all its inadequacies, was at minimum an acknowledgement that the people inside it existed, that they required some form of attention, that they could not simply be wished away. This acknowledgement carries more weight than it might initially seem. The history of marginalized people is, in large part, a history of being made invisible, denied the dignity of being seen, named, counted. acknowledged as part of the human community. The founding of dedicated institutions for the mentally ill, however brutal those institutions often were, interrupted that invisibility. It forced a reckoning, however incomplete, with the fact that minds could break, that this breaking was not uncommon, and that a civilized society had some obligation to respond. The question of what that response should look like would take hundreds of years to work out. The answers arrived slowly, through argument and experiment and failure and occasional moral courage. They are still arriving. The history of psychiatry is not a clean arc from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from cruelty to compassion. It is messier than that, full of reversals, of well-meaning interventions that caused harm, of brilliant insights that took generations to be accepted, of brutal practices that persisted long after better alternatives had been proposed. But every history has to begin somewhere. The opening of the first systematic institution for the care, if we can call it that, of people with mental illness marks one of those beginnings. It does not mark the beginning of understanding. Understanding would come much later. It marks the beginning of a sustained, institutional engagement with the question that had been hovering over human civilization since the first person stared into the distance and could not find their way back. What do we do with those whose minds will not hold? Bethlehem's answer, for many years, was chains. But the fact that an answer was being attempted at all, that the question was being taken seriously enough to build walls around it, to put a name above the door, meant that a different kind of answer was eventually possible. That is where this story begins. There is a moment in the life of any institution when it stops being merely a place and becomes a symbol. For Bethlehem Royal Hospital, that moment arrived gradually, then all at once, the way most transformations do. By the 17th century, the hospital had been operating for roughly 300 years. It had moved locations, expanded its capacity, acquired new patrons and new critics. It had outlasted plagues, civil wars, and the reigns of a dozen monarchs. And somewhere in the course of all the surviving, it had become something its founders could not have imagined: a spectacle. The word Bedlam, a slurred, compressed version of Bethlehem, had by this point escaped the hospital's walls entirely. It lived in the mouths of ordinary Londoners as a general term for chaos, for noise beyond reason, for situations in which all order had broken down. To say a place was a bedlam was to reach for the most extreme image of disorder available in the cultural vocabulary of the time. The hospital had lent its name to a condition. That alone should tell us something about how the institution was perceived, about what it had come to represent in the collective imagination of the city surrounding it. But the symbol was not only linguistic, it was architectural, social, and most disturbingly, theatrical. In 1676, Bethlehem relocated to a grand new building in Moorfields, north of the old city walls. The new structure was, by the standards of the era, impressive, designed in a style that drew comparisons to the Palace of the Tuileries in Paris. It featured a long, symmetrical facade, formal gardens, and an air of institutional confidence that its previous home had entirely lacked. The building announced something. It announced that the management of madness had become, in some sense, a civic project. Visible, deliberate, architecturally ambitious. What it did not announce because no announcement was necessary, was the practice that would define Bethlehem's reputation for generations to come. The hospital charged admission, not to the patients, of course, to the public, for a small fee, and sometimes for no fee at all on certain designated days. Ordinary Londoners could walk through the wards of Bethlehem and observe the patients within. They came in considerable numbers. Estimates from various periods suggest that the hospital received thousands of visitors each year, making it, by some measures, one of the most visited attractions in London. People came on Sundays after church. They came in family groups. They came on dates. They brought children. They walked the long corridors, peered through the doors or the iron grills, and looked at the men and women inside. What they were looking at, though most of them would not have framed it this way, were human beings in the depths of suffering, people experiencing psychotic episodes, severe depression, mania, conditions we can now name and partially understand, but which in the 17th century remained as mysterious as they were frightening. These patients were not performers. They had not consented to being observed. They had no mechanism to refuse. They were simply there, and the visitors were simply there, and the exchange between observer and observed was as unequal as any human transaction can be. The visitors laughed. This is documented, recorded by commentators and satirists, and the occasional appalled observer who found the practice disturbing even by the standards of an era not known for its delicacy. They laughed at the unusual behaviors, at the things patients said, at the physical expressions of interior distress that are, to an untrained eye, simply strange. They pointed. They made remarks. Some brought sticks to prod the patients through the bars. Others brought food, not out of charity, but as a means of eliciting reactions they could watch and discuss. We should resist the temptation to place all the moral weight of this practice on individual visitors. The people who paid to walk through Bethlehem's wards were not uniquely cruel. They were products of a culture that had developed no adequate framework for understanding mental illness, a culture in which the line between misfortune and divine punishment was blurry, in which disability of all kinds was often publicly displayed rather than privately protected. The exhibitions of people with physical deformities that were common in fairs and markets throughout Europe suggest a broad social tolerance for the objectification of those who deviated from bodily norms. Bethlehem's visiting practice existed within that tradition, not outside it, but understanding the cultural context does not dissolve the reality of what the patients experienced. Consider what it meant to be confined in Bethlehem during this period, already stripped of liberty, already subject to the physical rigors of restraint and institutional life, already separated from family and community and everything familiar, and then to have strangers arrive to stare at you, to be the object of someone else's entertainment, to have your suffering treated as a curiosity, your behavior as a performance, your worst moments as a form of leisure. The damage done was not only to individual dignity, it reinforced, at a social level, a way of thinking about mental illness that made genuine progress harder to achieve. When you pay to watch someone in psychological distress as a form of amusement, you are implicitly asserting that the person before you is fundamentally other, not a fellow human being caught in a terrible circumstance, but a different category of creature, one whose inner life is either absent or so alien as to be irrelevant. That assertion, normalized over generations, is an obstacle to compassion. It is an obstacle to the kind of imagination that allows one person to look at another suffering and recognize, there but for circumstances, themselves. Bethlehem's administrators were not unaware of the criticisms. By the early 18th century, voices were being raised in pamphlets, in literary works, in the testimony of reformers, against the visiting practice and against the conditions inside the hospital more broadly. The satirist William Hogarth included Bethlehem in his famous series of paintings depicting the moral decline of a young man, and his depiction of the hospital's interior was not flattering. Chaotic, degrading, populated by figures of misery and neglect. These critical voices mattered. They did not produce immediate change. Institutions rarely transform quickly, and Bethlehem had too much invested in its established practices to abandon them overnight. But they established a record of dissent. They created, within the broader culture, a contested space around the question of how the mentally ill should be treated, and that contestation was necessary before anything could improve. The visiting practice was eventually curtailed. By the early 19th century, partly under pressure from reformers, and partly because the medical profession was beginning to assert a different understanding of mental illness, one that emphasized observation, classification, and treatment rather than spectacle. The practice of public admission to Bethlehem's wards was discontinued. The doors that had been open to curious Londoners for more than a century were quietly closed. But the consequences of those open doors lasted longer than the practice itself. The image of Bedlam, the chaos, the laughter, the pointed fingers, the suffering on display, had embedded itself in the cultural memory of an entire civilization. It shaped, in ways both obvious and subtle, how ordinary people thought about mental illness for generations afterward. The association between madness and spectacle, between psychological distress and public shame, did not disappear when the visitors stopped coming. It lingered in language, in literature, in the instinctive embarrassment that still surrounds mental illness today. The history of Bethlehem is, in this sense, not merely a history of one institution in one city in one country. It is a compressed version of a much larger story, the story of how human societies have struggled, and often failed, to extend their moral imagination to those whose minds work differently, whose suffering is invisible in the ways that matter most, whose humanity is easiest to overlook precisely when it most needs to be affirmed. The doors at Moorfields eventually closed to the public, but the damage of those open years would take a very long time to undo. There are gestures in history that become larger than themselves. They begin as practical decisions, a specific action taken by a specific person in a specific place on a specific day, and then, over time, they accumulate meaning until they stand for something far beyond the original moment. The decision made by Philippe Pinel in Paris in 1793 is one of those gestures. He ordered the chains removed from patients in a psychiatric institution. That is the fact of it. The rest, the symbolism, the mythology, is the long shadow it casts across the history of medicine, is what the fact became. But to understand what Pinel did and why it mattered, it is necessary first to understand the world he did it in. France, in 1793, was a country in convulsion. The revolution had consumed the monarchy, and the terror was consuming the revolution. The guillotine was busy. The old certainties of class, of church, of the divine order of things, had been violently dismantled, and what would replace them was still brutally unclear. In the midst of this upheaval, an institution called the Bicêtre Hospital stood on the southern edge of Paris, housing a population that the revolution had not quite known what to do with. The poor, the criminal, the elderly, and the mad, all confined together in conditions that had changed very little from the medieval model that Bethlehem, across the Channel, had established centuries before. Pinel arrived at Bicêtre as its physician-in-chief in 1793. He was 50 years old, trained in medicine and mathematics, shaped by the Enlightenment conviction that the natural world, including the world of human thought and behavior, was subject to rational investigation. He was not by temperament or philosophy a man who accepted inherited practices simply because they were inherited. He looked at the patients in the Bicêtre cells, men chained to walls in the dark, and he asked a question that his predecessors had somehow failed to ask, or had asked and then set aside. What if we are making this worse? The question sounds simple. It was in fact radical. The prevailing assumption about the severely mentally ill in late 18th century Europe was that they were dangerous, and that danger was the defining characteristic. They were managed the way dangerous things were managed, restrained, isolated, kept from doing harm. The restraints were not experienced as a failure of care. They were experienced as care itself, or at least as the responsible exercise of custody over people who could not be trusted with freedom. To remove the chains was not merely an administrative change, it was an implicit argument about the nature of the people in those chains. An argument that they were something other than simply dangerous, that their condition was something other than simply a permanent state requiring permanent restraint. Pinel began methodically. He interviewed patients individually, something that was itself unusual. The idea that the testimony of a mentally ill person might constitute meaningful information, might tell a physician something worth knowing, was not widely accepted. He listened. He took notes. He constructed, patient by patient, something that began to resemble what we would today call a case history, a record of who this person was, what had happened to them, how their condition had developed, what made it better or worse. He was, in this sense, inventing a clinical practice that had no real precedent in the treatment of mental illness. What he found, consistently, was that the patients inside Bicêtre were not the undifferentiated mass of dangerous irrationality that the institutional logic assumed them to be. They were individuals. Some had been in chains for years, even decades. Some had been admitted following specific crises, grief, financial ruin, traumatic loss, and had stabilized, but remained confined because no one had revisited their cases. Some were genuinely violent, but even their violence, Pinel began to suspect, was not simply an expression of their illness. It was, at least in part, a response to their conditions. Kept in darkness, in cold, in chains, denied human contact and dignity and any form of meaningful activity, what would any person become? The unchaining, when it came, was not a single dramatic event, though history has sometimes rendered it that way. It was a series of decisions, patient by patient, carried out over time and not without resistance. Pinel had to persuade the revolutionary authorities that releasing these patients from their chains would not produce chaos, that the men he was proposing to unchain were not the monsters the institution had implicitly been treating them as. The negotiations were real, the skepticism was real, and the risk Pinel took professional, personal, perhaps physical-less in the volatile climate of the terror, was real. The patients who were unchained did not, for the most part, become violent. Some, exposed to fresh air and light, could, for the first time in years, showed immediate improvement. One patient, a former soldier who had been chained for 40 years, was able once freed to walk in the courtyard and engage in coherent conversation. He died within months, his body too damaged by decades of confinement to sustain him for long, but he died unchained. He died having been treated in his final months as a human being. Pinel recorded this case with evident feeling, and it is not hard to understand why. It contained, in miniature, everything he was arguing for. The possibility of personhood that institutions had been systematically denying, and the cost of that denial measured in a life. Pinel moved on to the Salpêtrière, a hospital for women, and applied the same principles. He continued writing, publishing in 1801 his treatise on insanity, a work that attempted to systematize what he had observed and to lay out a coherent approach to the classification and treatment of mental illness. The book was influential, read across Europe, translated into English, taken seriously by physicians who were beginning, however tentatively, to regard psychiatry as a legitimate branch of medicine rather than a custodial function dressed in medical clothing. His approach came to be associated with what contemporaries called moral treatment, a term that requires some unpacking because it does not mean quite what it sounds like. In the usage of Pinel and his contemporaries, moral referred less to ethics and more to what we might call the psychological or emotional dimension of life. Moral treatment meant attending to the patient's inner state, the relationships, the sense of purpose and dignity. It meant structured activity, calm environments, consistent and humane interaction with staff. It meant treating the patient as someone capable of reason and improvement, even if that capacity was currently obscured by illness. It was in many ways an anticipation of the therapeutic approaches that would not be fully developed for another century and a half. The influence of Pinel's work extended beyond France. In England, a Quaker businessman named William Tuke had, around the same time and independently of Pinel, established the York Retreat, an institution built on similar principles of humane care, structured routine, and the avoidance of physical restraint. The parallel development was not coincidence. It reflected a broader shift in enlightenment, thinking about the nature of the self, about the relationship between reason and unreason, about what a humane society owed to its most vulnerable members. None of this was swift. None of it was clean. The reforms Pinel advocated spread unevenly, encountered resistance, were implemented partially or cynically, or not at all in many institutions that adopted their language while preserving their cruelties. The history of psychiatric reform is not a story of ideas immediately transforming practice. It is a story of ideas doing slow, difficult battle with entrenched habits, economic interests, and the human tendency to treat the powerless as the circumstances of their powerlessness seem to permit. But Pinel had done something that could not be undone. He had looked at the people in the chains and seen people. He had asked what they needed rather than simply what they threatened. He had insisted, in the face of an institution built on the opposite assumption, that the mad were ill rather than merely dangerous, and that illness, even illness of the mind, called for treatment rather than punishment. In the long history of how human beings have treated one another, that insistence was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything that came next. There is a particular kind of tragedy that unfolds not from malice, but from confidence, not from cruelty, but from certainty. The asylum era in psychiatric history is that kind of tragedy. It began with genuine idealism, with the reformist energy of people who had looked at the old institutions, the chains, the public spectacle, the squalor, and decided that something better was possible. It ended, over the course of a century and more, with institutions that had become, in many respects, indistinguishable from what they had been built to replace. The road from Pinel's unchained patients to the vast, overcrowded state hospitals of the late 19th century is a road paved, in the most literal sense of the cliché, with good intentions. To understand how this happened, it is necessary to understand what the asylum was supposed to be. The word itself carried, in the early 19th century, a meaning it has since almost entirely lost. An asylum was a refuge, a sanctuary. The Latin root evokes protection, the idea of a place where the pursued could not be touched, where harm could not follow. When reformers in England, France, the United States, and across Europe began building dedicated institutions for the mentally ill in the decades following Pinel's work at Bicêtre, they used this word deliberately. They were not building prisons. They were building places of shelter, ordered, calm, purposefully designed environments in which the disordered mind could find the conditions it needed to heal. The therapeutic logic behind the early asylum was, by the standards of its time, sophisticated. It drew heavily on the moral treatment philosophy that Pinel and Tuke had developed, and it added to that philosophy an architectural dimension. The environment itself, reformers argued, was a therapeutic instrument. The right building, in the right setting, with the right routines and the right relationships between staff and patients, could facilitate recovery in ways that the old, chaotic institutions never could. Fresh air mattered. Space mattered. The view from the window mattered. Patients should have access to gardens, to meaningful work, to structured activity that gave shape and purpose to their days. They should be treated with dignity, addressed respectfully, regarded as people capable of improvement rather than irredeemable cases to be warehoused until death. These ideas were not foolish. In fact, much of what the early asylum reformers advocated anticipates principles that modern psychiatric care still endorses. The therapeutic value of structured routine, the importance of the physical environment, the damage done by treating patients as less than fully human. The York Retreat, established by William Tuke in 1796, became a model that reformers across the English-speaking world studied and attempted to replicate. Its early results were, by contemporary accounts, genuinely encouraging. Patients recovered. Some were discharged. The atmosphere was described by visitors as more closely resembling a large family home than an institution. The problem was scale. The York Retreat housed dozens of patients. The need that governments and reformers were attempting to address housed tens of thousands. As the 19th century progressed and industrialization transformed European and American societies, pulling people from rural communities into cities, dissolving the extended family networks that had previously absorbed individuals who could not fully care for themselves, creating new forms of poverty and dislocation and stress. The number of people identified as requiring institutional care grew at a rate that the moral treatment model was simply not equipped to handle. Institutions expanded, then expanded again. The grand asylum buildings that were constructed across England following the County Asylums Act of 1808, which mandated that counties provide institutional care for pauper lunatics, began as relatively modest establishments and became within decades enormous. An asylum designed for 200 patients might house 600 by mid-century, 1,000 by the century's end. The staff ratios that moral treatment required, close, consistent, individualized attention, became mathematically impossible. One keeper responsible for 50 patients could not have the kinds of conversations, could not provide the kind of attentive human presence that the therapeutic model demanded. As the institutions grew, they changed in character in ways that were almost inevitable given the pressures upon them. The carefully tended gardens became less carefully tended. The structured activities that were supposed to give patients purpose became, at scale, more custodial than therapeutic. Patients were set to work not because the work was good for them, but because the institution needed the labor. The respectful address and individualized attention gave way to the management of crowds, to rules applied uniformly, because individual judgment was too expensive and too slow. The asylum that had been designed as a refuge became, through the sheer pressure of numbers, something much closer to what its critics had always feared it would become. Physical restraint, which reformers like Pinel had worked so hard to eliminate, quietly returned. Not the medieval chains. The symbolism of those was too freighted now to easily restore, but straitjackets, locked rooms, padded cells, the various instruments of a system that had run out of other options. The non-restraint movement, championed in England by reformers like Robert Gardiner Hill and John Connolly, fought back against this drift throughout the middle decades of the 19th century, with some success. Connolly's work at the Hanwell Asylum in Middlesex demonstrated that a large institution could be managed without mechanical restraint. But the battles had to be fought again and again, institution by institution, because the pressures driving the return to restraint never went away. What was happening inside the asylums was also shaped by what was happening outside them. The 19th century was the century in which psychiatry, now beginning to call itself by that name, or something close to it, was attempting to establish itself as a legitimate medical discipline. This meant, among other things, developing systems of classification, attempting to identify the biological basis of mental illness, asserting the authority of the physician over the management of the asylum. It meant publishing journals, founding professional associations, developing a vocabulary that sounded appropriately scientific. It meant, in short, the institutionalization of psychiatry as a profession, occurring simultaneously with the institutionalization of patients in asylums. The relationship between these two processes was complicated. On one hand, the medical professionalization of psychiatry eventually produced real advances, more careful observation, better record keeping, the beginnings of genuine scientific inquiry into the nature of mental illness. On the other hand, the need to assert medical authority could work against the interests of patients. If the physician's expertise was paramount, the patient's own account of their experience became correspondingly less important, The therapeutic conversation that Pinel had pioneered, the actual listening to what patients said about themselves, was difficult to sustain in overcrowded institutions staffed largely by non-physicians, and it competed with an increasingly biological model of mental illness that looked for the causes of madness in the brain rather than in the patient's history, relationships, or circumstances. By the later decades of the 19th century, a deeply ambivalent picture had emerged. The old brutalities, the chains, the public spectacle, the casual violence of the pre-reform era had been substantially, though not entirely, eliminated from the better institutions. The idea that mental illness was a medical matter, requiring medical attention rather than purely moral or spiritual intervention, had taken firm hold among educated opinion. The beginnings of a scientific psychiatry were visible, even if the science remained crude. But the asylums themselves had become vast, impersonal, chronically underfunded holding facilities in which the majority of patients spent years or decades, and from which the majority never left. The therapeutic optimism of the early reformers had curdled. Recovery was no longer the expected outcome. Custodial care was. The asylum had ceased to be a place where people got better and had become a place where people were managed, indefinitely, invisibly at the margins of a society that had placed them there and then, for the most part, forgotten about them. The iron doors had been installed with the best of intentions. By the century's end, the intentions were barely visible anymore. What remained were the doors. There is something almost counterintuitive about the origins of psychoanalysis. The late 19th century was a period of extraordinary confidence in the physical sciences. Darwin had reorganized biology. Pasteur and Koch had transformed medicine by demonstrating that invisible microorganisms cause disease. The brain was being mapped, dissected, stained with new dyes, and examined under increasingly powerful microscopes. The dominant assumption among scientifically minded physicians was that mental illness, like every other illness, would eventually yield its secrets to the scalpel and the slide, that somewhere in the architecture of neurons and tissue lay the explanation for everything the mind could do wrong, and that once the explanation was found, the cure would follow. Into this climate of biological confidence stepped a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud and proposed something that sounded, to many of his colleagues, almost embarrassingly old-fashioned, that the way to understand and treat the suffering mind was to listen to it. Freud was not, at the outset, a revolutionary. He trained as a conventional neurologist, spent time in Paris studying with the great Jean-Martin Charcot, who was using hypnosis to investigate hysteria, and returned to Vienna to establish a private medical practice. His early patients were mostly middle-class women presenting with symptoms: paralysis, blindness, uncontrollable emotions, inexplicable physical complaints that had no detectable organic cause. The medicine of the era had limited patience for such cases. If nothing was visibly wrong with the body, the suffering was apt to be dismissed as exaggeration, weakness, or moral failing. Women in particular were vulnerable to this dismissal. Freud was more curious than dismissive, which was, in retrospect, the quality that mattered most. He noticed that when his patients talked at length, without interruption, without the physician steering the conversation toward predetermined conclusions, things emerged. Memories surfaced. Connections appeared between past experiences and present symptoms. Emotions that had apparently been buried found their way circuitously in the words. And when they did, the symptoms sometimes changed. Not always, not reliably, not in ways that could be easily measured or replicated, but enough to suggest that something real was happening, that the conversation itself was doing something that the consultation, the examination, and the prescription had not. This was the seed of what Freud's early collaborator Joseph Breuer called talking cure, a phrase that originated with characteristic irony with a patient rather than a physician. A young woman Breuer treated, known in the literature as Anna O, described the process of extended verbal exploration as chimney sweeping, a homely metaphor that nevertheless captured something accurate about the experience, the clearing of accumulated obstruction, the restoration of a passage that had become blocked. Freud developed this seed into an elaborate theoretical system over the following decades, and the details of that system, the id, the ego, and the superego, the Oedipus complex, the mechanisms of repression, projection, and sublimation, the interpretation of dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, became, in the 20th century, among the most widely debated ideas in the history of human thought. They were taken up by literature, by art, by philosophy, by anthropology, by the emerging culture industries of film and advertising. They reshaped, in ways that are still being untangled, how educated people in the Western world thought about themselves. But before considering the legacy, it is worth pausing on the central concept, because it was genuinely new, and its newness is easy to underestimate from the vantage point of a culture that has thoroughly absorbed it. The unconscious mind, the idea that the self contains depths inaccessible to ordinary introspection, that we are moved by forces we cannot directly observe, that the meaning of our behavior is often hidden from ourselves, was not, in 1900, an established fact. It was a proposition, and a controversial one. It violated the Cartesian assumption, deep in Western philosophical tradition, that the mind is transparent to itself, that to think is to know that one thinks. Freud was arguing that this transparency was an illusion, that the mind concealed as much as it revealed, and that what it concealed was precisely what mattered most for understanding psychological suffering. The method he developed to access this hidden territory was psychoanalysis. The patient lying on a couch, the analyst seated behind and out of sight, the patient speaking freely and without censorship, what Freud called free association, while the analyst listened for patterns, for repetitions, for the gaps and hesitations and sudden changes of subject that might indicate the presence of something avoided. The interpretation of dreams occupied a central place in the method, based on Freud's theory that during sleep, the mind's sensory mechanisms relaxed, allowing unconscious material to emerge in disguised form through the imagery of the dream. The therapeutic relationship itself became, in Freud's framework, a site of meaning. Patients, he observed, did not simply talk about their past relationships, they reenacted them. They experienced feelings toward the analyst, love, anger, dependence, resentment, that belonged, properly speaking, to earlier figures in their lives. Freud called this transference, and rather than treating it as an obstacle to therapy, he argued that it was therapy's most powerful instrument. By experiencing these old patterns in the relatively safe context of the analytic relationship, patients could examine them, understand them, and gradually loosen their grip. All of this was developed primarily in the context of private practice with neurotic patients, people who were functioning in the world but suffering, whose distress was real but whose grip on reality remained intact. Psychoanalysis was never primarily a treatment for the severely mentally ill, for the patients in the asylums whose lives had been consumed by psychosis or profound disability. Freud himself was largely pessimistic about the applicability of his methods to psychotic conditions, and the history of attempts to extend psychoanalysis to the severely ill is complicated and often unsuccessful. This is one of the fundamental tensions in Freud's legacy in psychiatry. His ideas were enormously influential in reshaping how the profession thought about the relationship between childhood experience and adult suffering, about the importance of the patient's own narrative, about the possibility that symptoms carry meaning rather than simply representing biological malfunction. These ideas filtered into psychiatric practice broadly, softening, at least in theory, the purely biological and custodial approach that the asylum era had entrenched. But they did so unevenly, and often in ways that created new problems alongside the old ones. The psychoanalytic movement Freud founded was, from its earliest years, marked by the intense intellectual and personal drama of its founder, the partings with Adler, with Jung, with Ferenczi, each departure accompanied by theoretical dispute and personal rupture. The resulting proliferation of schools and sub-schools, each claiming legitimate dissent from the original insights while arguing vigorously about what those insights actually meant, created a landscape of therapeutic approaches that was rich in ideas and sometimes bewildering in its contradictions. And Freud's own cultural context left marks on his theories that time has not been kind to. His ideas about female psychology, about homosexuality, about the universality of developmental patterns derived from a relatively narrow slice of Viennese bourgeois society. These have been extensively and justifiably criticized, revised, or abandoned by the practitioners who inherited his framework. The seduction theory he initially proposed and then retracted, which would have located the origins of neurosis in actual childhood sexual abuse rather than fantasy, remains one of the most debated and troubling episodes in the history of psychoanalysis, with consequences for how seriously clinicians took reports of abuse that lasted for decades. None of this erases what Freud accomplished. He created a new kind of attention, sustained, curious, non-judgmental, oriented toward meaning rather than mere symptom management. He insisted that the patient's inner life was not noise to be filtered out, but signal to be carefully read. He established the therapeutic relationship itself as a legitimate object of clinical scrutiny. He demonstrated that words, carefully exchanged over time, can move something in a suffering person that no drug and no institutional regimen had managed to reach. The unconscious, he described, may not exist precisely as he mapped it, but the territory he pointed toward, the hidden interior of human experience, shaped by history and relationship and the long shadows of the past, was real. It still is. Imagine a world where giants move slowly across endless snowy plains, covered in thick fur, with tusks like curved moons. A world where the wind sings ancient songs, and life thousands of years old, lies hidden beneath the snow. This story is not just about animals. It is a story of survival, of the cold, of the encounter between humans and nature, and of a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Where did the mammoths go? Why did such mighty creatures simply vanish one day? Today you'll embark on a journey through time to a place where glaciers breathed and the earth was home to true giants. And if you like stories like this, ones you can listen to before bed and feel like you're being transported to another world, please support the channel, subscribe, and give it a like. This helps create even more of these calm and atmospheric stories. And now, get comfortable. The story begins. Long ago, long before cities, roads, or even the earliest legends, the earth was a different place. Colder, wider, quieter. The air above the plains was sharp and clean, carrying nothing but wind, nothing but snow, nothing but an endless gray sky dissolving into the horizon. There were no landmarks, no borders, no names for things. There was only the cold, and whatever was strong enough to endure it. This was a world that did not forgive weakness. Only what could change would survive. And so across thousands of generations, something changed. The woolly mammoth did not appear suddenly, fully formed, as if conjured by the frost. It arrived slowly, the way all great things arrive, through patience, through pressure, through the quiet insistence of time. Its ancestors were ancient elephants, creatures of warmer lands, who had once wandered the forests and open savannas of a greener world. But the earth was shifting, the climate was cooling, and some of those ancient animals, for reasons we may never fully understand, did not retreat south toward the warmth. They kept moving north into landscapes that grew harsher with every generation, into winters that stretched longer and longer, into a cold that most creatures simply could not bear. And the cold began to shape them. This process, called evolution, works not through intention or desire, but through a ruthless kind of sorting. The animals best suited to the cold survived long enough to have offspring. Those offspring inherited their parents' slight advantages. A little more fur, a little more fat, ears that lost a little less heat. Over thousands of years, those small advantages accumulated. What began as an elephant adapted to temperate climates slowly became something new entirely. Something extraordinary. Something that belonged to the ice. By around 400,000 years ago, the woolly mammoth, Mammuthus primigenius, had fully emerged as a distinct species, and it was magnificent. Standing up to 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing as much as 6 tons, it was among the largest land animals of its time. But its size alone was not what made it remarkable. What made the woolly mammoth remarkable was how completely, how elegantly, how thoroughly it had been built for one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Begin with the coat. A woolly mammoth's outer layer consisted of long, coarse guard hairs that could reach lengths of 3 feet or more, hanging from the body like a shaggy curtain against the wind. Beneath this outer layer lay a dense undercoat of shorter, softer wool, fine and insulating, trapping warmth close to the skin. And beneath even that was a thick layer of fat, sometimes 4 inches deep, acting as both insulation and an energy reserve during the long months when food was scarce. Touch a mammoth, if such a thing were possible, and you would feel not the smooth firmness of a modern elephant's hide, but something closer to the deep, layered warmth of a heavy winter coat. Their skin itself was adapted. Sebaceous glands produced oils that waterproofed the fur, preventing moisture from reaching the body even during sleet or freezing rain. The skin was also notably thicker than that of the tropical relatives, an additional barrier against wind and cold. Everything about the mammoth's exterior had been refined over countless generations into a near-perfect system for retaining heat. Now consider the ears. Modern African elephants have enormous ears, great fanning structures that serve as radiators, releasing excess body heat in the sweltering heat of the savanna. A woolly mammoth's ears were dramatically smaller, perhaps 1/10 the size. There was no need to cool down. Every adaptation pointed in the opposite direction. Retain heat, conserve energy, survive the winter. The tusks deserve their own attention. Long, curved, sometimes sweeping into full spirals, a woolly mammoth's tusks could reach lengths of 14 feet in older males. They were used for many things: for fighting rivals during mating season, for stripping bark from trees, for digging through frozen ground in search of roots. But their most essential function may have been simpler. Mammoths used their tusks to sweep aside deep snow, to excavate the frozen surface of the ground and expose the dry grasses and sedges buried beneath. Picture an enormous animal on its knees in the snow, working steadily, methodically, uncovering the food that would keep it alive through another Arctic winter. Those great curved tusks were not ornaments. They were tools. The mammoth's teeth, too, were specialized. Like modern elephants, mammoths were hypsodonts. They had high-crowned teeth with ridged surfaces perfectly designed for grinding tough, fibrous vegetation. Over a lifetime, a mammoth cycled through 6 sets of teeth. As one set wore down from years of chewing coarse grasses, another would move forward from the back of the jaw to replace it. When the final set was gone, the animal could no longer feed effectively and would eventually die. A mammoth's lifespan was written, in some sense, in its teeth. What did these animals eat? The world they inhabited, known to scientists as the mammoth steppe, was not a barren wasteland of snow and ice, as we might imagine. It was a vast cold grassland, stretching from Western Europe across Siberia and into North America, rich with grasses, sedges, flowering plants, shrubs, and mosses. During the brief Arctic summer, this landscape briefly bloomed, providing an abundance of food. During the long winters, the grass dried and was buried in the snow, but it did not disappear. Mammoths learned, or rather evolved, to find it. They could smell vegetation through the snow, and the tusks did the rest. They were not solitary creatures. Mammoths, like their elephant cousins, lived in family groups, led by the oldest and most experienced females. These matriarchs were the memory of the herd. They remembered the ancient migration routes, the locations of water sources that did not freeze, the sheltered valleys where wind was less punishing, the places where grass was deepest and most nourishing. The knowledge accumulated over decades and was the difference between survival and death for the entire group. Young mammoths stayed with their mothers for years, learning the landscape, learning to read the wind, learning all the things a mammoth needed to know. And so they moved through this vast, white world, slowly, patiently, deliberately. Great herds crossing frozen rivers, calves stumbling forward through deep snow, flanked on all sides by the warm, enormous bodies of their relatives. Old matriarchs leading the way, reading a landscape that had not changed in 10,000 years. It is easy, looking back across the distance of time, to see the mammoth as a symbol of a lost world. And in some ways, it was. But it is more accurate to see it as a triumph, an animal that rose to meet an impossible challenge and succeeded so completely that it dominated an entire continent for hundreds of thousands of years. The woolly mammoth was not a creature out of place in the cold. It was the cold's own creation. The ice did not threaten it. The ice made it. And for a long, long time, that was enough. The sun on the mammoth's steppe was a pale and distant thing. Even in summer, it skimmed low across the horizon, casting long shadows over a landscape that seemed to stretch without end. In winter, it barely appeared at all, a brief, cold light on the southern edge of the sky before the darkness returned. And yet this world, so hostile to the human eye, was alive. Profoundly, stubbornly, magnificently alive. This was the mammoth's kingdom, and they knew every inch of it. To understand how mammals lived, you must first understand the world they lived in. The mammoth steppe was the largest terrestrial biome of the Pleistocene epoch, a vast cold grassland that once covered more of the Earth's surface than any other single habitat. It stretched from the Atlantic coast of Europe eastward across Siberia, over the land bridge that once connected Asia to North America, and deep into the interior of the continent we now call Alaska and the Yukon. It was not a tundra in the modern sense, not the wet, boggy, sparsely vegetated landscape that covers much of the Arctic today. It was drier, colder, and far richer in plant life. Grasses and sedges grew in dense, continuous mats across the plains. Flowering plants erupted in brief, brilliant bursts during the short summers. Willows and dwarf shrubs hugged the ground in sheltered hollows. It was a hard world, but a full one, and it fed, among many other creatures, the greatest land animal of the Ice Age. Mammoths were, above all else, creatures of movement. They did not stay in one place. They could not. An animal the size of a woolly mammoth requires an enormous amount of food. Estimates suggest that an adult male needed to consume between 180 and 400 pounds of vegetation every single day just to maintain its body weight and energy levels. No single patch of steppe could support a herd for long, and so they walked. They walked constantly, following the seasons, following the grass, following the routes that had been memorized and passed down through generations of matriarchs across thousands of years. These migrations were not random. They were deliberate, structured, and ancient. As winter deepened and snow buried the southern grazing grounds, herds moved. They crossed frozen rivers with a steadiness that suggested long familiarity. These were not new roads, but remembered ones, worn into the collective memory of the herd over generations. In spring, as the permafrost softened and the first grasses pushed through the mud, the herd shifted again, moving toward the freshest, most nutritious vegetation. Summer brought a kind of abundance, brief but intense, and the mammoths made full use of it, feeding heavily, building up the deep layers of fat that would carry them through the coming winter. Then autumn arrived, as the cold returned, and the great cycle began again. At the center of every herd was its matriarch. She was typically the oldest female, often 40, 50, even 60 years old, and her age was not a liability. It was her most valuable asset. Elephant memory is not a myth or a metaphor. It is a biological reality, documented in modern elephants and almost certainly present in their mammoth cousins. A matriarch remembered. She remembered where water could be found in drought, where sheltered ground lay beneath the worst of the blizzards, where the grass was deepest after a good summer, and where danger had come from before. Her decisions guided the herd not through dominance alone, but through knowledge, the irreplaceable, accumulated knowledge of a long life spent on the steppe. Around her moved the rest of the family group, younger adult females, adolescents, and calves. Young males stayed with the matriarchal herd until they reached adolescence, at which point they gradually drifted away, eventually joining the loose, roving groups of bachelor males that wandered the steppe independently. These young bulls were often recognizable by their restlessness, moving more erratically, covering greater distances, occasionally approaching other herds with posturing and noise during the annual period of hormonal activity known as muss, a condition shared with modern elephants, during which males became aggressive and determined to mate. Life for a mammoth calf began in the center of the herd, surrounded on all sides by adults. A newborn mammoth weighed perhaps 200 pounds, substantial by any ordinary measure, but tiny relative to the world it had entered. It was covered in a reddish-brown coat of fine hair and was capable of standing within hours of birth. But standing was only the beginning. The steppe offered no time for a long, sheltered infancy. Calves needed to keep pace with the herd, which meant walking from the first days of life, navigating uneven ground, frozen river crossings, and the deep snow of their first winter. They did not do this alone. Mammoth herds were intensely social, and the care of young calves was a collective responsibility. Females who were not the calf's mother, aunts, older sisters, cousins, would stand close to a struggling calf, using their bodies as windbreaks, guiding it away from danger, helping it back to its feet if it slipped on ice. This behavior, called allomothering, is well documented in modern elephants and almost certainly existed in mammoths. It made evolutionary sense. Calves were enormously valuable. The slow reproductive rate of large mammals meant that every calf represented years of investment. The herd could not afford to lose one carelessly. The sounds of a mammoth herd would have been remarkable to human ears. Modern elephants communicate across vast distances using infrasound, low-frequency rumbles below the range of human hearing, transmitted not only through the air but through the ground itself, sensed by other elephants through the sensitive skin of their feet. Mammoths almost certainly did the same. A herd on the move was produced a constant, subtle trembling in the earth, a conversation conducted in frequencies we cannot hear, coordinating movement, signaling danger, maintaining contact between individuals separated by miles of open steppe. What seemed, from a distance, like silence was in fact full of meaning. At rest, the herd drew together. When temperatures plummeted, as they could on the open steppe, to minus 40 degrees or colder, mammoths pressed close to one another, their great shaggy bodies forming a wall against the wind. Calves sheltered in the center of these clusters, surrounded by the warmth of the adults. In such moments, The herd became almost a single organism, breathing together, swaying slightly, conserving heat through closeness and stillness. Hours could pass this way. The wind howled across the steppe. The darkness stretched in all directions. And at the center of it all, the mammoths waited, patient and warm for whatever came next. They were not passive creatures, however. Mammoths were capable of speed, short bursts at least, and of formidable aggression when threatened. Their size alone was a deterrent against most predators. Cave lions, giant hyenas, even the great short-faced bear of North America would have thought carefully before approaching an alert adult mammoth. When threatened, adults form defensive formations, placing calves in the center and presenting the tusks outward. There are indications in the fossil record of mammoths with healed injuries from predator encounters, evidence of battle survived, of animals that had fought and continued living. The steppe was dangerous. The mammoths knew it, and they responded accordingly. And so the days of the mammoth steppe passed, in movement and in stillness, in cold and in brief warmth, in the noise of the herd and in the long, infrasonic conversation that carried across the frozen plain. These were not simple animals wandering blindly through a frozen world. They were complex, intelligent, deeply social creatures, shaped by millions of years of evolution into something perfectly matched to their environment. They belonged there in the truest sense, not merely tolerating the cold, but thriving within it, organized by it, defined by it. The mammoth steppe was their world, and for a very long time, it was enough. They arrived quietly, as humans tend to do. There was no single moment of first contact, no dramatic encounter on an open plain, no instant of mutual recognition between two kinds of intelligence meeting for the first time. It happened gradually, over centuries and millennia, as modern humans spread northward and eastward out of Africa and into the cold landscapes of Europe and Asia. They came in small groups, following game, following rivers, following coastlines. They were curious, adaptable, and extraordinarily good at learning. And somewhere on the vast, windswept mammoth steppe, the world and the world of the mammoths finally overlapped. What those first encounters looked like, we cannot know with certainty, but we can imagine. A small band of hunters, perhaps a dozen individuals, crouched behind a low ridge of frozen earth, watching. Below them, in the broad flat valley, a herd of mammoths moved slowly through the snow. The animals were enormous, far larger than anything the hunters had faced before. The breath rose in clouds above their shaggy heads. The ground trembled faintly as they walked. The hunters watched for a long time before they moved at all. They were not equals. The mammoth outweighed a human being by a factor of more than 100. It was stronger, thicker skinned, and equipped with weapons, those great curving tusks that could kill a person with a single blow. A lone human, armed with a spear, could no more bring down a woolly mammoth than bring down a boulder. This was not a contest of individual strength. It never was. The remarkable thing about early humans was not their physical power, but their minds. Their ability to plan, to cooperate, to solve problems together that no single individual could solve alone. And so they planned. The hunting strategies used by Paleolithic people against mammoths were varied, and the evidence for them comes from multiple sources: archaeological sites, the distribution of mammoth bones, the topography of landscapes surrounding known kill sites, and careful study of how modern hunter-gatherer peoples approach large, dangerous prey. What emerges is a picture not of reckless bravery, but of careful, patient, collective intelligence. One approach involved driving. Hunters would spread out around a herd or around a lone animal thus separated from its group, and use noise, fire, and coordinated movement to steer it toward a natural trap. The edge of a cliff, a steep-sided ravine, a frozen lake whose ice might not hold the weight of a 6-ton animal. The mammoth did not need to be killed by human hands directly. The landscape could do much of the work if the hunters understood it well enough to use it, and they did. There's evidence from multiple sites in Europe and North America of mammoths that died in exactly these kinds of circumstances. Bones found at the base of cliffs, in bogs, at river crossings, clustered in ways that suggest not random misfortune, but deliberate human action. Another approach was ambush. Young, old, or injured animals were the preferred targets, individuals separated from the protective formation of the herd, already weakened by age or sickness, less capable of the explosive defensive response that a healthy adult could deliver. Hunters would approach downwind, moving slowly and silently, closing the distance until they were near enough to drive spears into the animal's flanks or underbelly, where the hide was thinner and the vital organs closer to the surface. This required enormous patience and precision. A wounded mammoth was still a deadly mammoth. A hunter who miscalculated the distance, or who threw a moment too soon, could easily be killed. The weapons they used were more sophisticated than they are often given credit for. The spear thrower, a simple device that acted as an extension of the throwing arm, dramatically increasing both the speed and the force of a thrown spear, had been in use for tens of thousands of years by the time humans were hunting mammoths on the Eurasian steppe. Later the atlatl, and eventually the bow and arrow further extended the range at which a hunter could strike. Spear points made from flint, obsidian, and other fine-grained stones were knapped with remarkable skill, producing edges sharper than modern surgical steel. These were not primitive weapons. They were precision instruments, crafted by people who understood both the materials they worked with and the anatomy of the animals they hunted. A successful mammoth hunt was transformative for the group that achieved it. A single adult mammoth could provide hundreds of pounds of meat, enough to feed a band of hunters and their families for weeks, particularly in the depths of winter when other food sources were scarce or absent. But the mammoth gave far more than meat. Its hide, thick and tough, could be cured into leather for clothing, footwear, and the coverings of shelters. Its long outer fur could be twisted into rope or woven into rough textiles. Its bones, large, dense, and plentiful, were used as construction materials in regions where timber was scarce. The curved ribs and leg bones of mammoths formed the structural frames of dwellings, covered with hides and insulated with earth. Mammoth ivory was carved into tools, needles, handles for knives, and ornaments. Even the fat rendered from a mammoth's body had value, burned in stone lamps to provide light and heat through the long Arctic winters. Nothing was wasted. This was not sentiment. It was survival. And yet there was something beyond survival in the relationship between humans and mammoths. Something harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. They drew them across the caves of Europe, at Chauvet, at Lascaux, at Font de Gaume, at dozens of other sites. The images of mammoths appear on the walls in ochre and charcoal and manganese, rendered with a vividness and accuracy that still astonishes. The artists who made these images knew mammoths intimately. They captured the distinctive high-domed skull, the slopey back, the great curved tusks, the heavy fringe of fur along the belly. Some images show mammoths in motion, others in stillness. Some appear to be part of larger scenes involving multiple animals. A few seem to show individual animals with distinctive markings or postures, as if the artist was recording not a generic mammoth, but a specific one. An animal they had observed, perhaps many times, and remembered. Why did they draw them? This question has occupied archaeologists and anthropologists for generations, and no single answer has emerged. Some argue that the images were part of hunting rituals, a way of capturing spiritual power over the animal before the hunt, of rehearsing the kill in a sacred space. Others suggest the caves were places of initiation, of ceremony, of communal memory. Still others point to the sheer aesthetic pleasure evident in the images, the evident delight in representation, in capturing the shape and weight and presence of a living creature on a stone wall, and suggest that art, even then, needed no justification beyond itself. Whatever the reason, the act of drawing a mammoth required something important: attention, sustained, careful, respectful attention. You cannot render an animal accurately unless you have watched it for a long time, unless you have noticed the particular way it holds its head, the specific angle of its tusks, the texture of the fur along its shoulders. The people who painted those cave walls had looked at mammoths the way you only look at something you find worthy of looking at. They feared them, certainly. They hunted them when they could. But they also, in some way that we can still feel across 40,000 years, admired them. There is a painting in the Chauvet cave in southern France, estimated to be more than 30,000 years old, that shows a group of mammoths rendered in confident, flowing lines. The animals are not frozen or static. They seem almost to be moving, heavy, deliberate, alive. Someone stood in that cave, in the flickering light of an oil lamp, and made those marks with their hands. Someone chose, out of everything in the world, to put the mammoth on the wall. That choice tells us something. It tells us that even then, even at the very beginning of the relationship between our species and theirs, humans understood that the mammoth was something worth remembering. It did not happen all at once. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the extinction of the woolly mammoth, that it was not a single catastrophe, not one terrible winter or one final hunt, but a long, slow unraveling, a fraying at the edges of a world that had held together for hundreds of thousands of years, coming apart thread by thread, season by season, generation by generation, until one day there was nothing left to fray. The end began with warmth. Around 15,000 years ago, the Earth's climate entered a period of profound and accelerating change. The glaciers that had shaped the planet for tens of thousands of years began to retreat. Ice sheets that had covered vast stretches of North America and Eurasia pulled back toward the poles, exposing bare rock and churned soil beneath. Sea levels rose as the meltwater flooded into the oceans. the land bridge connecting Asia to North America, the broad, flat corridor across which both mammoths and humans had once walked freely, disappeared beneath the waves of what would become the Bering Strait. The world was reorganizing itself, and it was doing so faster than any living thing could easily accommodate. For the mammoth steppe, the consequences were devastating. The cold, dry grassland that had sustained mammoths and dozens of other large animals for millennia began to shrink. As temperatures rose and moisture increased, the open plains gave way to something different. Wetter, softer, ecologically transformed. In many regions, forests advanced northward, replacing the grass and sedge that mammoths depended upon. The permafrost that had kept the ground frozen and firm began to thaw in places, turning broad stretches of steppe into waterlogged bog, terrain that was difficult for large, heavy animals to cross, and nearly impossible to graze effectively. The mammoth steppe did not disappear overnight, but it retreated, fragmented, broke into isolated patches, separated by landscapes that offered mammoths little of what they needed. The herds began to shrink, not immediately, and not everywhere at once, but the trajectory was clear. Populations that had once ranged freely across entire continents found themselves increasingly confined to shrinking corridors of suitable habitat. Migration routes that had existed for thousands of years were severed by rising seas, by expanding forests, by the slow transformation of the ground itself. Herds that had once numbered in the thousands were reduced to hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. And with every reduction in population size came a new and compounding problem. Genetic diversity collapsed. This matters more than it might seem. Large genetically diverse populations are resilient. They contain within them a wide range of inherited variations, some of which will prove useful in the face of new challenges. Small isolated populations lose this resilience rapidly. Harmful genetic mutations, which in a large population would be diluted and suppressed, begin to accumulate and spread. Inbreeding becomes inevitable. The population grows not only smaller but biologically weaker, less adaptable, more vulnerable to disease, less capable of responding to further environmental stress. Scientists studying mammoth DNA recovered from permafrost specimens have found clear evidence of exactly this process. In the final millennia of the species, genetic diversity declined sharply, and the signs of inbreeding and mutational accumulation are unmistakable in the ancient genomes. But climate alone may not have been enough to finish them. Into this contracting world came the other pressure, the one that walks on two legs. By the time the mammoth steppe began its long retreat, humans were everywhere. They had spread across Europe, Asia, and the Americas with remarkable speed, carrying with them not only their spears and their fire, but their intelligence, their relentless ability to adapt, to learn, to exploit whatever resources a new environment offered. Wherever they went, they hunted. And wherever they hunted large animals that had never encountered human predators before, those animals suffered disproportionately. This pattern, called the overkill hypothesis, or more broadly so the concept of Pleistocene overkill, was first proposed by the ecologist Paul Martin in the 1960s and has been debated intensely ever since. The core observation is striking. Across the globe, the extinction of large mammals correlates with remarkable consistency to the arrival of modern humans. In Australia, where humans arrived roughly 50,000 years ago, the great megafauna, giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, a tortoise the size of a small car, disappeared shortly afterward. In North America, the arrival of humans around 13,000 years ago was followed within a few thousand years by the extinction of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, and dozens of other large species. The timing is not proof, but it is deeply suggestive. Mammoths, for all their size and power, were poorly equipped to cope with human hunters. They reproduced slowly. A female mammoth carried a calf for nearly 2 years before giving birth, and calves required years of intensive care before they were independent. This meant that mammoth populations could not recover quickly from sustained hunting pressure. Remove too many adults from a herd, and the herd may never replace them. Kill enough calves, and a generation is simply lost. Human hunters did not need to be particularly efficient to be devastating. They only needed to kill slightly more mammoths, year after year, than the population could replace. Given enough time, even modest overhunting would be enough. And the humans of the late Paleolithic were not modest hunters. They were skilled, coordinated, and highly motivated. In a world where a single mammoth could feed a family for weeks, the incentive to hunt was overwhelming. There is archaeological evidence of mammoth kill sites where the bones of dozens of individual animals are found together. Accumulations that suggest repeated, systematic hunting of the same species at the same locations over many years. These were not opportunistic encounters. They were organized campaigns. The debate among scientists today is not really about whether both climate and humans played a role. Most researchers now accept that both were involved, but about the relative weight of each factor. In some regions, and at some times, climate change may have been the dominant pressure. In others, human hunting may have driven local extinctions even before the climate has shifted significantly. The picture is complex, geographically varied, and still not fully resolved. What is clear is that the two pressures combined, shrinking habitat and sustained hunting, created a situation from which the mammoths could not recover. The end came in stages. By around 10,000 years ago, mammoths had disappeared from most of their former range, from Europe, from the continental interior of Asia, from North America. But they didn't vanish entirely, not yet. On islands isolated from the mainland, small populations persisted, cut off from both human hunters and from the full force of the changing climate. On Wrangel Island, a remote Arctic outpost north of Siberia, woolly mammoths survived until approximately 4,000 years ago, long after the pyramids of Egypt had been built, long after the first cities had risen in Mesopotamia, long after the Bronze Age had begun in Europe. They were smaller than their mainland ancestors, reduced by the pressures of island life and limited resources, but they were still mammoths, still walking the frozen ground, still digging through snow for grass with their great curved tusks. And then, quietly, they were gone. There was no witness to the last mammoth, no one standing on the tundra of Wrangel Island on the day the final animal died, no one to record the moment or mark it in any way. The last mammoth simply stopped living, as all things eventually do, and the species that had walked the earth for 400,000 years ceased to exist. The steppe that had shaped them was gone. The herds that had sustained them were gone. The matriarchs who had carried the memory of migration routes across decades were gone. There was nothing left to remember, and no one left to remember it. Just the bones, slowly settling into the permafrost. just the silence spreading across the plain, just the wind moving over a world that had become, without quite anyone noticing, a little emptier than it had been before. The ground remembers what the air forgets. In the deep cold of the Arctic, in the frozen soil of Siberia, Alaska, the Yukon, and the remote islands scattered across the top of the world, time does not pass the way it does elsewhere. In most places, the dead are reclaimed quickly. Bacteria, fungi, insects, and weather conspire to break down organic matter within years, sometimes within weeks, returning it to the soil and the air and the water from which it came. Nothing is preserved. Everything cycles. But in permafrost, ground that has remained continuously frozen for thousands of years, that process stops. The cold arrests decay almost entirely. What falls into the permafrost, or is buried by it, is held, suspended, kept. And what has been kept in that frozen darkness is extraordinary. Woolly mammoths have been emerging from the permafrost for centuries. Indigenous peoples of Siberia encountered their bones and tusks long before Western science took notice. The Yakut people had legends about enormous subterranean creatures, called mammoth, that lived underground and died when they surfaced into the light. These stories may have been attempts to explain the mysterious bones that appeared in riverbanks after floods or in eroding cliffsides along Arctic coastlines. Bones too large to belong to any living animal, appearing as if from nowhere, embedded in the earth itself. The legend of the underground mammoth persisted for generations, a folk explanation for a genuinely puzzling phenomenon. Western science began paying serious attention in the 18th century, and what it found exceeded all expectation. The permafrost was not merely preserving bones, it was preserving bodies. In 1799, a Siberian hunter discovered a mammoth frozen into the bank of the Lena River, its flesh and hide still largely intact after perhaps 40,000 years in the ice. When scientists finally examined it, the specimen now known as the Adams mammoth, after the botanist who eventually retrieved it, they found not just a skeleton, but an entire animal, skin, fur, and preserved soft tissue. It was, in every meaningful sense, a mammoth, not a fossil, not a cast or a reconstruction. The actual animal, pulled from the same ground in which it had died tens of thousands of years before. Since then, dozens of exceptionally preserved mammoth specimens have been recovered from permafrost across the Arctic. Each one is remarkable. Each one tells us something that bones alone cannot. There is Luba, discovered in 2007 in northwestern Siberia by a reindeer herder named Yuri Kudi. She was a female calf, approximately 1 month old at the time of her death, and she is the most complete mammoth specimen ever found. Her eyes are closed. Her trunk curves gently to one side. Her skin is intact. Her eyelashes preserved. The fine reddish hair of her coat still visible across her body. Analysis of her remains revealed that she died by suffocation. She had inhaled mud, probably while trying to drink from a riverbank that collapsed beneath her, and that in her final hours she had consumed her mother's milk. The contents of her stomach and intestines were preserved. The bacteria in her gut were preserved. She died 42,000 years ago, and she looks, lying in a glass case in a Russian museum, as if she fell asleep recently and might yet wake up. There is Yuka, a juvenile female found in 2010 on the Laptov Sea coast of Siberia, with long reddish hair still covering much of her body and evidence of ancient human interaction. Cut marks on her bones that suggest she was butchered by people not long after her death. There's the Yarkov mammoth, an adult male whose frozen remains were lifted from the Siberian tundra by helicopter in 1999, encased in a block of permafrost. There are partial specimens, isolated limbs, preserved skin patches, and frozen blood. Actual liquid blood, recovered in 2013 from a mammoth found on an island in the Laptov Sea, still fluid at minus 17 degrees Celsius due to a natural antifreeze mechanism in the mammoth's hemoglobin that scientists had not previously known existed. Every specimen rewrites what we thought we knew. The frozen blood told us that mammoths had evolved a form of hemoglobin adapted to release oxygen more efficiently in cold temperatures, a discovery that has implications not just for understanding mammoths, but for the broader science of cold adaptation in mammals. The stomach contents of preserved specimens have revealed the precise details of what mammoths ate in their final days. Specific grasses, sedges, mosses, flowering plants, even fragments of tree bark. Isotope analysis of mammoth tusks has allowed scientists to reconstruct individual life histories, tracking seasonal migrations, identifying periods of stress, even detecting pregnancy in female specimens by reading the chemical record laid down in the tusk's growth layers year by year, like rings in a tree. The permafrost is a library, and we're only beginning to learn how to read it. Among the most consequential discoveries of recent decades has been the recovery of ancient mammoth DNA, beginning in the 1990s and accelerating rapidly with advances in genomic technology. Scientists have extracted and sequenced genetic material from dozens of mammoth specimens, building an increasingly detailed picture of the species' evolutionary history, population structure, and biology. We now know that woolly mammoths were most closely related to Asian elephants, sharing a common ancestor that lived approximately 6 million years ago. We know that mammoth populations experienced several severe bottlenecks, periods of dramatic population reduction, during the history, each one leaving a detectable signature in the genetic record. We know which specific genes were altered in mammoths compared to their elephant relatives, and we're beginning to understand how those alterations produced the cold adaptations that made them so successful. This genetic knowledge has opened a door that was, until recently, firmly closed. The possibility of bringing the woolly mammoth back, or something very close to it, is no longer purely the territory of science fiction. Several research groups around the world are actively pursuing what is sometimes called de-extinction, using the tools of modern genomics and genetic engineering to restore mammoth traits in living animals. The most prominent of these efforts is led by the company Colossal Biosciences, founded in 2021, which is working to edit the genome of the Asian elephant, the mammoth's closest living relative, to incorporate key mammoth genes, those responsible for cold-adapted hemoglobin, for the growth of long insulating fur, for the accumulation of subcutaneous fat, for the smaller ears and other anatomical features of the Arctic-adapted mammoth. The goal is not to produce a perfect genetic replica of a woolly mammoth. That may be impossible, and it is certainly not the near-term objective, but to create an elephant that can survive and thrive in Arctic conditions, filling the ecological role that mammoths once played. The ecological argument for this project is serious and deserves to be taken seriously. There is growing evidence that the presence of large grazing animals on the Arctic steppe, animals that compact snow, knock down shrubs, and encourage the growth of grasses, helps maintain the permafrost by preventing it from warming and thawing. The thawing of Arctic permafrost is one of the most consequential potential feedback loops in the current climate crisis. Vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane are stored in frozen Arctic soil, and their release as the permafrost thaws could dramatically accelerate global warming. Restoring large grazers to the Arctic, mammoth-like animals that could replicate the ecosystem engineering of the original mammoth steppe, might help slow or partially reverse this process. The mammoth, in other words, might matter not only as a relic of the past, but as a tool for managing the future. Whether this will succeed, whether the scientific, ethical, and logistical challenges can be overcome, remains genuinely uncertain. Creating a cold-adapted elephant is one thing. Creating a viable, self-sustaining population capable of meaningfully altering Arctic ecosystems is another challenge entirely, orders of magnitude more complex. The critics of de-extinction raise legitimate concerns about animal welfare, about the diversion of conservation resources from living endangered species, about the hubris of believing that we can simply undo the consequences of past destruction by deploying new technology. These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions worth asking. Because the mammoth story, it turns out, is not finished. It has entered a new chapter, one written not in ice and bone and ancient migration, but in laboratories and genomes, in the restless human desire to recover what has been lost. 40,000 years ago, someone stood in a firelit cave and drew a mammoth on the wall. They wanted to remember. Perhaps in our own strange way, so do we. Imagine the night. The silence is so deep, as if the world itself has held its breath. And somewhere in that silence, a story begins. Not just about the past, but about the moment when people first decided to change their destiny. The French Revolution isn't just about kings and guillotines. It's about voices that refuse to be silenced any longer. Its streets filled with the whispers of hope and the rumble of approaching change. It's a time when fear slowly gave way to determination. Today, you'll hear this story as if you were standing there yourself, amidst the narrow streets of Paris, under a heavy sky, where a new era is about to dawn. And if you like stories like this, if you want to support our channel and help these stories live on, be sure to subscribe and give us a like. And now, get comfortable. The story begins. France at the end of the 18th century resembled a vast castle, magnificent from the outside, yet rotting within. Its spires pierced the sky, its facades gleamed in the sunlight, and from a distance it seemed unassailable. But step closer and you could hear the beams cracking, the plaster crumbling, and feel the coal seeping through the gaps in the walls. A coal that no fireplace, however grand, could fully chase away. It was a country of two worlds, existing side by side and barely knowing each other. The first world occupied Versailles, a city palace built to the will of kings and transformed into a temple of extravagance. Everything here was designed to astonish. The Hall of Mirrors, stretching more than 70 meters in length, multiplied the light of thousands of candles until it became dizzying. Ceilings were painted with scenes of triumph and allegories of greatness. The garden's fountains ran on days of celebration, and the water in them seemed to flow not by the laws of nature but by royal decree. Courtiers in powdered wigs and gold-embroidered coats glided through the halls, observing an elaborate ritual of etiquette in which every step, every bow, every word carried meaning. King Louis XVI woke publicly, dined publicly, and retired publicly. His life a perpetual performance staged for a select audience. Louis was a man who, by all accounts, should never have been born a king. He loved hunting, locksmithing, and card games. Simple, comprehensible pursuits. The complexity of statecraft weighed on him, and the need to make firm decisions brought agonizing hesitation. His wife, Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess turned French queen, was fashioned from different material entirely. Vivacious, pleasure-loving, surrounded by favorites and fashionable dressmakers, she was adored and despised by the court in equal measure. The people whom she almost never saw despised her from a distance, calling her Madame Deficit for her extravagance at a time when the country was suffocating under debt. The Second World began immediately beyond the palace gates, and it was strikingly different. French society in those years lived by rules established many centuries before. The entire population was divided into 3 estates, 3 parts of a single nation, arranged so unequally that the very division seemed a mockery of common sense. The first estate was the clergy. The church owned vast tracts of land, by various estimates, between 6 and 10% of all property in France. The upper clergy lived in comfort and influence, sat on councils, had a voice in affairs of state, and paid almost no taxes, contributing only a voluntary gift to the treasury, the size of which they determined themselves. The lower clergy, village curates, led a far more modest existence, often little different from that of their own parishioners. The second estate was the nobility, some 400,000 souls in a country of more than 20 million. They held command positions in the army, the highest posts at court and in provincial administration. They were exempt from most taxes and retained feudal rights over the peasantry. The right to collect dues, the right to hunt across others' fields, the right to mills and presses which the peasants were obliged to use, and naturally to pay for. The nobility guarded its privileges jealously, closing ranks at the slightest threat to them. The third estate was everyone else, roughly 97% of the population, wealthy merchants and street vendors, lawyers and laborers, craftsmen and peasants. What united them was simple. They paid. They paid the land tax and the poll tax, paid the indirect taxes on salt and tobacco, paid the church tithes. When the treasury emptied, and it emptied regularly, the state devised new means of extracting money from them, because the first 2 estates were adept at evading any attempt to share the burden. The peasants, who made up the majority of the third estate, lived as their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived, in wooden houses with earthen floors, working plots of land that barely fed a family. They rose before dawn and lay down after dark. The backs were bent by ceaseless toil, the faces burned by the sun and roughened by the wind. In good years, they managed to make ends meet. In bad years, they went hungry. And in the 1780s, bad years were plentiful. The climate across Europe in those decades was harsh. Unusually cold winters gave way to parched summers. Harvests fell short, and the price of grain rose relentlessly. Bakeries in the cities could not always meet demand. In the villages, mothers mixed bran into their flour, and then, when even that ran short, added bark and leaves to the bread. This was not merely everyday hardship, it was a slow, silent catastrophe drawn out across years. But what makes a person truly dangerous is not hunger alone. It is hunger joined to the awareness of injustice. And this is where ideas entered. The 18th century in Europe is called the Age of Enlightenment, and not without reason. Philosophers, thinkers, and polemicists wrote about the nature of power, the rights of man, and what a just society ought to look like. Voltaire mocked religious dogmatism and aristocratic arrogance. Rousseau declared that man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains. Montesquieu developed his theory of the separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial, by which no single branch could become absolute. The books were banned, confiscated, burned, and for precisely that reason they were read with fierce, clandestine appetite. Ideas spread the way fire spreads through dry timber, slowly at first, then all at once. In the salons of Paris, educated men and women debated questions that would once have been unthinkable to raise aloud. Why should some be born to privilege and others to obligation? By what right did one man command and another obey? What was the source of royal authority, and could that authority be revoked? These were not idle philosophical games. They were questions that, once asked clearly enough, demanded answers. And the answers, when they came, had a way of leading somewhere no one had quite intended to go. The city itself seemed to feel the change. Paris in the late 1780s was crowded, tense, and restless. Thousands had drifted in from the countryside, driven by failed harvests and the hope of work, only to find the capital overstretched and indifferent. They settled in the narrow streets of the working districts, in rooms so small that families slept in shifts, in courtyards that never saw the sun. They stood in line for bread before daylight, and sometimes found, when they finally reached the front, that there was none left. They listened to street orators who spoke of freedom and rights and the rottenness of those who ruled. They listened and they remembered. Somewhere deep in the fabric of this old and unequal order, something was shifting. It was not yet visible, not yet loud. It was more like a change in the air before a storm, a stillness with an edge to it, a silence that felt less like peace and more like held breath. The whisper of change had begun, and those with the wisdom to listen could already hear it growing. The 1780s did not arrive gently in France. They came the way bad decades tend to come, not with a single catastrophic blow, but with an accumulation of smaller miseries, each one manageable on its own, each one adding its weight to the last, until the combined mass became something no ordinary person could carry. The harvests were the first sign. Across the countryside, farmers watched the skies with a particular anxiety of people whose entire existence depends on weather they cannot control. In 1788, the summer brought hailstorms of extraordinary violence. In some regions, hailstones the size of a fist flattened fields that had been weeks from harvest. What the hail did not destroy, a drought-hardened August finished off. Then winter arrived early and with savage cold, freezing the rivers, killing the livestock that had survived the summer, and cutting off the roads along which grain might otherwise have moved from regions of plenty to regions of want. By the time spring came in 1789, it came to a France that was genuinely, acutely hungry. The price of bread, that single most important number in the life of an ordinary French family, climbed to heights that defied comprehension. In Paris, a laborer who earned perhaps 20 to 30 sous a day might find himself spending 15 or even 18 of them on a single loaf. There was almost nothing left for rent, for firewood, for the clothing that the same bitter winter demanded. Men pawned tools they needed for work. Women sold a few pieces of jewelry they had saved from better times. Children went without shoes. The cold and the hunger together created a particular kind of misery, the kind that is not dramatic, that does not announce itself, but simply grinds, day after day, wearing people down to something rawer and more dangerous than despair. In the cities, the visible signs multiplied. Beggars crowded the approaches to churches and the markets. Lines outside bakeries formed before dawn and sometimes stretched the length of a street. Pamphlets appeared on walls and were torn down and appeared again. Street corners acquired their orators, men who stood on crates or overturned barrels and spoke loudly about things that not long ago would have earned them a night in prison. Now the crowds that gathered around them were too large and too hungry for the authorities to disperse with any confidence. The countryside, meanwhile, was consumed by a particular fear known later as the Great Fear. Rumors moved through villages with extraordinary speed. Rumors that bands of brigands were coming, that the grain stores were being emptied, that the nobles had hired outlaws to destroy the harvest so that the people would starve into submission. The rumors were almost never true, but the panic they generated was entirely real. Peasants armed themselves with whatever they could find: scythes, pitchforks, old hunting muskets, and waited. And while they waited, some of them decided not to wait passively at all, but to settle certain old scores with the lords whose meals they were forced to use, whose hunting parties trampled their crops, whose ledgers recorded debts that seemed to grow no matter how faithfully they were paid. But the physical hunger, as devastating as it was, tells only part of the story. Alongside it, sometimes overlapping it, sometimes running ahead of it, was a different kind of hunger altogether, a hunger of the mind. The ideas of the Enlightenment had not remained confined to the elegant salons where they were first debated. Over decades they had seeped downward and outward, carried by books and pamphlets, by traveling peddlers who sold forbidden literature from the bottoms of their packs, by soldiers who had fought in America and come home with strange new notions about liberty rattling around in their heads. The American Revolution of 1776 had not gone unnoticed in France. Many Frenchmen had fought in it, the Marquis de Lafayette among them, and they returned with first-hand knowledge that the old order was not the only possible order. A republic had been founded. A king had been defied. The world had not ended. If anything, it had rearranged itself into something that looked, from a distance, rather more sensible. The philosophe had spent decades dismantling the intellectual foundations of the old regime with the patient precision of craftsmen removing stones from a wall. Voltaire had made it fashionable to laugh at priests and nobles. And laughter, as every satirist knows, is one of the most corrosive forces in existence. Once people begin to find the powerful ridiculous rather than awe-inspiring, the psychological scaffolding of authority begins to buckle. Rousseau went further. He did not merely mock the existing order, he imagined a different one. His concept of the social contract proposed that legitimate government rested not on divine right or inherited tradition but on the consent of the governed. Power, in Rousseau's vision, flowed upward from the people, not downward from God through kings. It was a simple idea, and it was incendiary. Montesquieu had given people a vocabulary for thinking about how government could be structured differently, with laws that applied to everyone equally, with power separated so that no single person or body could hold all of them at once. The Encyclopédie, that vast collaborative project to which dozens of thinkers contributed, had spent years arguing, in article after article, that the world could be understood rationally, reformed rationally, improved rationally. Nothing was sacred simply because it was old. Everything could be questioned. Everything could, in principle, be changed. These ideas found their most eager readers not among the aristocracy, though some nobles were fashionably progressive, but among the educated middle class, what the French called the bourgeoisie, lawyers, doctors, merchants, journalists, teachers, men who had education and ambition, but found the upper rungs of society firmly blocked by the accident of birth. A man might be brilliant, learned, capable of running a city or drafting a constitution, and yet be barred from any meaningful political power simply because he had not been born into the right family. The injustice was not merely material, it was increasingly a matter of wounded dignity, and wounded dignity in sufficient quantity becomes something very like fury. It was this class, educated, frustrated, articulate, that would eventually provide the revolution with its leaders, its language, and its extraordinary energy. But in the late 1780s, they were still, for the most part, writing pamphlets and attending debates and arguing in coffee houses. The arguments were growing sharper, though. The pamphlets were growing bolder, and the audience for both was growing larger by the month. What happened in those years before the explosion was not simply that people became angrier, though they did. It was that anger and ideas found each other, and the combination proved more volatile than either alone. A starving man is desperate. A starving man who has been told, in language he can understand, that his starvation is not natural, not inevitable, not the will of God, but the direct result of a system designed to keep him down. That man is something else entirely. Paris became the crucible in which these elements mixed. The Palais Royal, with its arcades and gardens open to anyone who cared to walk through, became an outdoor parliament of sorts, a place where printers sold pamphlets, orators harangued crowds, and the news of the day was debated with an intensity that would have seemed extraordinary even a decade before. The cafes that lined these galleries never emptied. Arguments that began over coffee continued into the street, and arguments that began in the street followed men home and kept them awake at night. The kingdom was running out of money. The king was running out of options. The people were running out of bread. And across the country, in village squares and city courtyards and lamp-lit rooms where men bent over forbidden books, ideas were quietly, relentlessly doing their work. The kindling had been gathering for a long time. It was dry now, and deep, and it covered everything. All it required was a single spark, and France in the spring of 1789 was a country where sparks were everywhere. The fire was coming. Everyone could feel it. Almost no one knew how to stop it. And a growing number, hungry, angry, and newly certain of their rights, had stopped wanting to. The summer of 1789 arrived in Paris like a held brace finally released, not with relief, but with the sharp, unpredictable force of something that has been compressed too long. June had brought political crisis to a head. The Estates General, that ancient representative assembly, which had not been convened in 175 years, had been summoned by a desperate king seeking a way out of his financial catastrophe. The three estates had gathered at Versailles in May with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Hope that something might finally change. Suspicion that the old guard would find a way to ensure that nothing did. The suspicion proved well-founded. Almost immediately, the question of how votes were to be counted produced a deadlock so bitter that it revealed, more clearly than any pamphlet could, just how irreconcilable the interests of the estates had become. The third estate, outnumbered in the old system, perpetually outvoted by the combined weight of clergy and nobility voting as blocks, refused to play by rules designed to defeat them before they began. In a gesture of defiance that felt, even to those who made it, like crossing some invisible and irreversible line, they declared themselves a national assembly. They were not merely representatives of their estate, they announced. They were representatives of the French people, all of them. The distinction was not technical. It was revolutionary. When they arrived at their meeting hall on the 20th of June and found the doors locked against them, the king, it was said, had ordered the room closed for preparations for a royal session. They did not disperse. They moved to a nearby indoor tennis court, and there, in a large, bare, echoey room that smelled of sweat and wooden floors, they swore an oath. They would not separate, they declared, until they had given France a constitution. The tennis court oath was not a battle, and it shed no blood, but it was, in its way, an act of war, a declaration that the people's representatives would no longer wait for the king's permission to represent the people. Louis wavered. He ordered the assembly dissolved. The assembly, in the person of the astronomer and statesman Jean-Sylvain Bailly, replied with words that have echoed ever since. The assembled nation could not receive orders. Louis, uncertain what to do next, did what he most often did in moments of crisis. He hesitated, and then, slowly, he gave way. But even as he appeared to yield, he was moving troops. Through late June and into early July, regiments began arriving at the outskirts of Paris. Soldiers set up camps on the fields around the city. Cannon were positioned at key points. The king and his advisors, particularly his more conservative ministers, who had never believed that concession was wisdom, were preparing, many suspected, to dissolve the assembly by force and return France to something resembling the old order. On the 11th of July, the king dismissed his finance minister, Jacques Necker, who was broadly popular and seen as sympathetic to reform. The news reached Paris the following day. The city, already wound tight as a spring, snapped. On the 12th of July, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table outside the Café de Foix in the gardens of the Palais Royal. He had heard the news about Necker. He was frightened and furious, and he communicated both with an orator's instinctive gift. The dismissal of Necker, he cried to the crowd pressing around him, was a signal. The troops massing outside the city were about to move, and when they did, the massacre of patriots would begin. He snatched a leaf from a tree and pinned it to his hat as a cockade of protest. The crowd surged. Within hours, Paris was in motion. That night, the streets were lit by more than the usual lamps. Crowds moved through the city, breaking open the customs posts at the city's gates, symbols of taxation and control, and setting them alight. Wax figures of Necker and the Duc d'Orléans were carried through the streets in mock funeral procession. The Royal German Cavalry, attempting to clear the place Louis XV, was met with a hail of stones and driven back. A lieutenant colonel named Lambesque found his regiment unable to advance. The streets belonged to the people of Paris that night, and they knew it. But weapons were needed. Courage alone could not hold off trained soldiers and cavalry. On the morning of the 13th of July, crowds stormed the monasteries and armorers' shops, seizing whatever they could find. The Hôtel des Invalides, the great veterans' hospital and military complex, was raided for its cache of muskets. Thousands of rifles were carried out into the streets. Now the crowd was armed. Now it was something more organized than a mob, though less organized than an army. It was a city in revolt, finding its own shape as it moved. And it moved toward the Bastille. The Bastille Saint-Antoine stood in the eastern quarter of Paris, a fortress of 8 towers, rising from a wide, dry moat, its walls 12 feet thick at their narrowest. It had served for centuries as a royal prison, and though by 1789 it held only 7 inmates, its symbolic weight was enormous. It represented arbitrary power in its most physical form, the power of the king to imprison anyone without trial, without charge, without explanation, by the simple mechanism of a lettre de cachet, a sealed royal letter that was its own verdict and its own sentence. People had entered the Bastille and been forgotten there. The building did not ask for reasons. It simply held. It also held gunpowder. Tens of thousands of cartridges were stored inside its walls, and the crowd, now armed with muskets and no ammunition, needed them. The morning of the 14th of July dawned warm and clear. By mid-morning, a crowd of several hundred had gathered in the square before the fortress. Delegations were sent in to negotiate with the governor, the Marquis de Launay, a frightened, indecisive man who found himself in command of a garrison of perhaps 80 veteran soldiers and 30 Swiss guards, facing a city that had stopped obeying. He offered assurances. He would not fire first. He lowered the drawbridge to the outer courtyard to demonstrate good faith. The crowd surged in. What happened next is difficult to reconstruct with precision, because those who were there gave different accounts, and those who came later shaped the event into a story that served their purposes. What is certain is that shots were fired, whether from the fortress or from the crowd first is disputed, and the situation collapsed from negotiation into battle. The crowd took cover, returned fire, pushed forward. Some soldiers from the regular French army, sympathetic to the uprising, arrived with cannon. Delaunay, watching his position become untenable, considered blowing up the powder magazine and taking the surrounding neighborhood with him. His own men stopped him. At around 5 in the afternoon, he surrendered. The drawbridge came down. The crowd poured in. Delaunay was taken prisoner and led through the streets. He did not reach any formal custody. He was killed in the crowd, his head splayed on a pike, a brutal coda to an afternoon that had already exceeded anyone's expectations of what was possible. 7 prisoners were freed. They emerged blinking into the late afternoon light to find themselves celebrated as martyrs, heroes of a struggle some of them had barely been aware of. The gates of the Bastille stood open. Its towers, which had seemed permanent as geology, were already beginning to be dismantled. Parisians chipping away at the stones with the enthusiasm of people destroying something they have feared for too long. The news spread through France with the speed of fire on a dry plain. In the provinces, people wept, celebrated, rioted, and reorganized local governments almost overnight. In Versailles, the king was woken in the night by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt and told what had happened. Louis, half asleep and struggling to comprehend, asked whether it was a revolt. The Duke's reply has been remembered ever since. "No, sire," he said, "it is a revolution." He was right. What had fallen with the Bastille was not merely a prison. It was the idea that the old order was permanent, inevitable, beyond challenge. That idea, once shattered, could not be reassembled. The stones of the Bastille would be sold as souvenirs, carried across France as relics of a day that everyone who lived through it understood, however dimly, had changed everything. France would never be the same. And deep down, even those who feared what came next already knew it. Revolutions, it turns out, do not stop when they have achieved what they set out to achieve. They do not pause at the moment of victory to take stock, to rest, to allow the dust to settle. They have their own momentum, a forward pressure that builds with each successive event, each successive crowd, each successive act that would have been unthinkable the week before and becomes, the week after, merely the latest thing that has happened. France, in the months and years following the fall of the Bastille, discovered these truths with a thoroughness that left almost no one untouched. The immediate aftermath of July 1789 looked, for a brief and luminous moment, like the beginning of something genuinely hopeful. The king came to Paris. He stood at the Hôtel de Ville and accepted a tricolor cockade, blue and red for the city, white for the monarchy, pinned to his hat. The crowd cheered. There were tears. Men who had been enemies the week before embraced in the streets with the slightly dazed sincerity of people who cannot quite believe the world has shifted as far as it has. Lafayette, the hero of the American War, was appointed commander of the new National Guard, a citizens' militia that replaced the old royal troops in Paris. The assembly continued its work at Versailles, and the work was extraordinary. In a single night in August, the 4th of August, a night that those who were there would describe for the rest of their lives with a mixture of awe and bewilderment, the nobles and clergy in the assembly rose one after another to renounce their privileges. Feudal dues, the tithes, exclusive hunting rights, the private courts of the nobility. All was rendered in a cascade of voluntary abnegation that lasted until 2 in the morning and left the participants themselves astonished at what they had done. 3 weeks later came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 17 articles that attempted to translate the abstract language of Enlightenment philosophy into the concrete language of law. All men are born free and equal in rights. Sovereignty resides in the nation. The law is the expression of the general will. Liberty consists in being able to do anything that does not harm another. These were sentences that had been thought before, written before, debated before in salons and coffee houses and the pages of philosophical treatises. But now they were official. Now they had the force, or at least the aspiration, of fundamental law. They were printed and posted and read aloud in town squares across France, and the people who heard them understood, even if they could not have said precisely why, that something important had been named. But the bread was still expensive. The hunger had not ended with the revolution in politics. In October, it was women, the market women of Paris, accustomed to dealing in the daily realities of food and price, who took matters into their own hands. Several thousand of them marched from Paris to Versailles in the rain, armed with pikes and kitchen knives and a focused, furious purpose. They wanted bread, and they wanted the king in Paris, where they could watch him. They got both. The royal family was brought back to the capital and installed in the Tuileries Palace, effectively under the informal custody of a city that had stopped trusting them. The assembly followed. The revolution had moved to Paris, and Paris would not let it go. The years that followed were years of almost unbearable intensity, political, intellectual, and eventually physical. The assembly worked with feverish energy, redesigning France from the ground up. The old provinces were abolished and replaced with 83 new departments, each roughly equal in size, each governed by elected councils. A deliberate erasure of the regional loyalties and local power structures that had complicated French governance for centuries. The church was nationalized, its land sold off to pay the national debt, its clergy required to swear an oath of loyalty to the new constitutional order. Many refused. The refusal would have consequences that no one in 1790 could fully anticipate. The king, meanwhile, was becoming a problem that no constitutional formula could quite solve. Louis XVI was not, by temperament, a man capable of the sincere transformation that his position required. He accepted the new constitutional monarchy with his lips, while his heart remained elsewhere. In June of 1791, he demonstrated this with devastating clarity. The royal family, disguised as servants, climbed into a large Berlin carriage and slipped out of Paris in the night, heading east toward the border and the Austrian armies beyond it. The flight was a confession, a declaration, more eloquent than any speech, that the king had never truly accepted what his people had made of France. He was recognized and stopped at Varennes, a small town in Lorraine, brought back to Paris in humiliation and in silence. The crowds lining the route removed their hats not in respect, but in contempt, a reversal of royal ceremony so precise, it seemed almost choreographed. After Varennes, it was the question of the monarchy became impossible to avoid. There were those who still wanted to believe in constitutional kingship, who argued that France needed a king as a stabilizing figure, that the alternative was chaos. There were those who had concluded, from the evidence of Varenne alone, that this particular king was irredeemably untrustworthy and the institution itself a danger to the revolution. Between these positions the assembly oscillated, and the oscillation satisfied no one. War complicated everything. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, a decision driven by a combination of genuine fear of a foreign intervention, revolutionary enthusiasts for spreading the new ideas by force, and the cynical calculation of various factions that war would clarify the political situation in their favor. It clarified it, certainly, but not in ways anyone had predicted. The French armies, the officer corps decimated by the emigration of noble officers who had fled the revolution, performed disastrously at first. Prussian forces crossed the border. The Duke of Brunswick, commanding the Allied armies, issued a manifesto threatening Paris with total destruction if the royal family were harmed. The manifesto was intended to protect the king. Its effect was precisely the opposite. On the 10th of August 1792, the Tuileries Palace was stormed. The king was suspended from his functions and imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval tower in Paris that now became a royal jail. The monarchy was not yet formally abolished, but it had ceased, in any practical sense, to exist. A new body, the National Convention, was elected by universal male suffrage, the first time in French history that all men, regardless of property, had the vote. It met for the first time on the 20th of September, the same day that French forces stopped the Prussian advance at Valmy. France would survive. But the France that would survive was already something quite different from what anyone had imagined in 1789. The convention abolished the monarchy on its first full day of work. It declared France a republic. And then, with the methodical energy of a body that had a great deal to do and not much time, it put the king on trial. The trial of Louis XVI lasted through December and into January. He was accused of conspiracy against liberty and crimes against the state, charges that were in some respects legally dubious and in other respects simply true. He defended himself with a quiet dignity that surprised those who had expected him to crumble. It changed nothing. The convention voted on his guilt. He was found guilty. It voted on whether to appeal to the people. The appeal was rejected. It voted on the sentence. A majority, by the narrowest of margins, voted for death. On the 21st of January, 1793, Louis XVI was taken by carriage through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine had been adopted as the official instrument of capital punishment the previous year, recommended by its proponent as more humane than previous methods, swift and equal in its application, making no distinction between the noble neck and the commoners. Louis mounted the scaffold with composure. He attempted to address the crowd. The drums drowned him out. The blade fell. An epoch ended in that moment. Not just the reign of a particular king, but an entire conception of what France was, what authority meant, what the relationship between ruler and ruled could be. The crowds in the square were variously silent, exultant, horrified, and numb. Across Europe, the courts of kings received the news with a cold fury that would translate, in the months ahead, into a coalition of enemies more formidable than France had yet faced. The revolution had consumed its king. It was not finished consuming. Robespierre fell on a Thursday. The 9th of Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, the 27th of July, 1794, by the old reckoning, began like many days had begun in Paris over the previous year, with anxiety, with watchfulness, with the particular tension of people who have learned that the political ground can shift beneath their feet without warning and without mercy. But this day would end differently from the days that had preceded it, because on this day, the man who had built the machinery of the terror finally turned it upon the man who had come to embody it. Maximilien Robespierre had not always been a figure of dread. In the early years of the revolution, he had been known with genuine affection as the Incorruptible, a lawyer from Arras of modest origins and austere habits, who seemed to want nothing for himself and everything for the Republic. He dressed carefully, powdered his hair in the old style, and spoke with a precision that impressed even those who disagreed with him. He believed, with the fervor of a man who has made a political program out of a moral vision, that the Republic could only be saved by virtue, and that virtue could only be enforced by terror. The enemy was everywhere, in the prisons, in the ministries, in the convention itself. The revolution had to be defended, permanently, without hesitation, without mercy. What followed from this logic was the period that history would call the Reign of Terror. Roughly a year, from the autumn of 1793 to the summer of 1794, during which the machinery of revolutionary justice operated at a speed and scale that transformed it from justice into something else entirely. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established to try enemies of the Republic, had originally been conceived as a safeguard against the mob violence of the September massacres, a way of giving legal form to the process of identifying and punishing counter-revolutionaries. Under the pressure of war, conspiracy, and the paranoid logic of a leadership that had begun to see treachery in every shadow, it became a conveyor belt. The numbers are sober and staggering in equal measure. Across France, in the 15 months of the terror's peak, somewhere between 16 and 40,000 people were executed. The range reflects the difficulty of counting deaths that occurred in many different ways, in many different places, many of them far from the guillotine in Paris. The blade in the Place de la Révolution claimed the famous and the obscure alike. Aristocrats and priests, of course, but also Girondins who had sat in the same assemblies as their accusers, generals who had lost battles, merchants accused of hoarding, farmers denounced by neighbors, settling old scores that had nothing to do with the Republic. Marie Antoinette went to the guillotine in October 1793, her hair cropped, her hands bound behind her back, maintaining to the end a composure that her enemies found infuriating and her admirers found heartbreaking. The Girondin leaders, those moderate Republicans who had argued for a less centralized and less violent revolution, followed her weeks later. The revolution, it was said, devours its children. It was devouring them now with systematic efficiency. But even at the height of its power, the terror contained within itself the conditions of its own destruction. Fear is a powerful political tool, but it is a tool that erodes the hand that holds it. When no one is safe, when even demonstrated loyalty is no guarantee of survival, when a word from an informant or a letter intercepted at the post can send a man to the tribunal within days of his arrest and to the scaffold within hours of his verdict, then the circle of potential victims expands until it includes everyone, including eventually those who built the circle. By the summer of 1794, the men who sat in the Committee of Public Safety The small executive body that had effectively governed France through the Terror had begun to look at each other with the calculating eyes of men who understood that the next purge might well include themselves. Robespierre had become isolated, erratic, increasingly given to long silences and dark suggestions about traitors within the government itself. At the Festival of the Supreme Being, a grand civic ceremony he had organized in June to replace the Catholicism the revolution had suppressed with a new civic religion of his own design. He had stood apart from his colleagues in a way that felt more like a warning than a celebration. The implications seemed clear. He knew things. He was watching. No one was beyond suspicion. It was his fear, not courage, not principle, not a sudden collective conversion to moderation, that drove the conspiracy of Thermidor. On the 9th of that month, Robespierre rose to speak in the convention and found himself shouted down, something that had not happened to him in years. He was accused, arrested, and taken to the Luxembourg prison. That night, in a less desperate act of resistance, his allies at the Paris city government, the Commune, rose in his support and brought him to the Hôtel de Ville. But the city did not rise with him. The journeys that had saved the revolution before, the great popular uprisings that had stormed the Bastille, that had marched to Versailles, that had toppled the monarchy, did not materialize. Paris was exhausted. Paris was frightened. Paris, in the end, let it happen. In the early hours of the following morning, soldiers sent by the Convention broke into the Hôtel de Ville. Robespierre was found with a shattered jaw, shot though by his own hand or another's, has never been conclusively established. He was carried to the Conciergerie, tried before the same tribunal whose procedures he had helped design, and guillotined without being permitted to speak. 21 of his closest associates were executed with him. The crowd, which had watched so many executions with varying degrees of feeling, was this time loud and unambiguous. They cheered. What came after Thermidor was not, at first, so much a new beginning as an unclenching, a slow, cautious relaxation of a fist that had been closed so long it had nearly forgotten how to open. The surviving Girondins were released from prison. The most zealous members of the revolutionary committees were themselves arrested and tried. The revolutionary tribunal was reformed, then effectively dismantled. The law of suspects, that broad and terrifying instrument which had allowed arrest on the basis of vague association with counter-revolutionary ideas, was repealed. Churches, which had been closed or converted to temples of reason during the dechristianization campaign, began quietly to reopen. In the streets of Paris, young people who called themselves the Jeunesse Dorée, or the Gilded Youth, appeared in extravagant clothes and attacked the remaining Jacobin clubs with a ferocity that was partly political and partly the simple human need to punish someone for the years that had just passed. The Thermidorian reaction, as it came to be known, was not a restoration of the old order. The old order was gone, genuinely, irreversibly gone. The nobles who had emigrated were not invited back. The feudal dues were not reinstated. The Declaration of the Rights of Man remained the foundational statement of French political life. What Thermidor represented was something more modest and more durable, the revolution's discovery of its own limits, the point at which France stepped back from the edge of an abyss it had been approaching for years and asked, quietly and with considerable exhaustion, whether there might be another way. The directory that replaced the Committee of Public Safety was not an inspiring government. It was corrupt, unstable, and perpetually threatened from both the royalist right and the Jacobin left. It lurched from crisis to crisis with the graceless ingenuity of a regime that knows it has no legitimacy but has not yet found a replacement. It survived by managing its enemies against each other, by military victories abroad that provided glory and loot when domestic politics provided neither, and by the simple momentum of institutions that had not yet collapsed entirely. It was the military victories that mattered most, and it was the military victories that introduced into French political life a figure who had been accumulating successes in Italy and Egypt with a speed and brilliance that made the politicians in Paris simultaneously grateful and uneasy. Napoleon Bonaparte was 30 years old when he returned from Egypt in October 1799 to find France weary of the Directory and ready for something it could not quite name. On the 18th of Brumaire, the 9th of November, he moved. The coup was messy and nearly failed. In the Council of 500, deputies surrounded him shouting "traitor," and he had to be dragged out by his own grenadiers. His brother Lucien, presiding over the council, saved the moment by stepping outside and telling the soldiers that a group of assassins within were threatening the representative of the people. The soldiers went in. The deputies fled. By morning the Directory was dissolved, and a new government, the Consulate, with Bonaparte as first consul, had taken its place. It was not, strictly speaking, the end of the revolution. The laws it had produced, the administrative structures it had built, the principles it had inscribed into the language of modern politics, these things endured. France would carry them forward into the 19th century and beyond, and they would spread, in one form or another, across the world. But something had ended. The great turbulent decade of uprising and experiment and terror and hope had found its full stop. Not in a blaze of renewed idealism, not in a triumphant restoration of order, but in the quiet pragmatic figure of a small man from Corsica who understood power with a clarity that the revolution, for all its brilliance, had never quite managed. France was changed, permanently, profoundly, and beyond any possibility of return. The old castle with its cracking walls had not been repaired. It had been torn down, stone by stone, and something entirely new had been built in its place, imperfect, unfinished, still contested, but undeniably there. The whisper that had begun in the corridors of Versailles and the hungry streets of Paris had become, over 10 extraordinary years, something that the whole world could hear. And the world, listening, would never be quite the same again.